All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back, and it is now time for me to introduce our next presenter. Our next presenter is Mal Hyman. Mal is an educator and has served as an associate professor of sociology at Coker College in Hartsville, South Carolina, since 1987, and is currently the coordinator of their political science program. He received the South Carolina Governor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 1993 and was named Coker College's Master Professor of the Year in 1992, 1999, and 2012. Mal is the author of Burying the Lead, The Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy. His presentation today he'll be giving this morning is entitled Comparing Media's Treatment of JFK and MLK Assassinations. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mal Hyman.
Thanks. Thanks, Don. Good morning. Good to join you. I've been at this a while, but I'm really second generation. When I started teaching at the junior high school level, I noticed everybody was listening when I talked about political assassinations. When I taught in a state prison from 1977 to 1982, everybody was listening, and it was a great break in a way because it clarified my ability to see through spin, and I think allowed me to look at politics a little bit more clearly. From a media family, my dad was a newspaper publisher, my brother's a broadcast journalist. We've been talking about this for years, and I've got a little overview for you. It's a daunting topic. Took me 3 decades to put together a book on media coverage of the assassination of John Kennedy. I've had maybe 3 months to work on media coverage of Martin Luther King. But I can give you an outline on it, and I think I can lead you to some different patterns and observations. Thanks to David and Don for organizing the conference. It's really a team effort. It's a team effort with researchers. We build on each other's work. To some of the people that have been at this for years, for Gary, John Newman, Robert Groden, thank you. I mean, we build on each other's work. Democracy is a team sport. One of the fellows I'm indebted to is a fellow named Jeff Cohen. Does anyone know Jeff? Yeah, worked in Los Angeles on the Martin Luther King assassination for years, going around to churches. And I met him, and he said, LA Times will not cover this. We need to actually have a journal that analyzes the mass media. Because he'd been speaking on it for years, and he finally said to me, you know, the only way to believe the government report on the Martin Luther King assassination is to not read it. And he was right about that. And I'm indebted to Jeff, too. He went on to work and set up a magazine called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And Jeff is now teaching journalism in upstate New York in Ithaca. And what I'll give you is just an overview. Jeff was looking at media ownership patterns, and I'm sure you've seen charts of that. He would look at boards of directors of major mass media outlets in a cross-section of corporate America. And a question that he asked me years back, still I think is a fair one today, does the mass media cover minimum wage even on Labor Day? So there's this editing that goes on from ownership as well as an ideological perspective, and then you move into how they deal with national security issues. And I'll pass around a couple documents that you may not have seen with the editor of Look magazine working with the CIA, and in 1962 was sent to Russia, and he interviewed Khrushchev, and then he came back and he talked with the director of Central Intelligence. I don't know if anyone has seen that report. Okay, I'll just pass it around. So it's at the highest level. Now, whether Kennedy knew about this Whether Robert Kennedy knew about this, we really don't know. But it's evidence of the close ties between our mass media and the intelligence agencies, which really had started from World War I on. Eisenhower would groom reporters by putting them in with officers during World War II. And the notion in the mass media was that it was a Cold War emphasis on war and thus cooperation with national security with most of the major mass media outlets. I'm picking on Look because they performed some of the roles that Life magazine and Time magazine did with the assassination of John Kennedy. I also have a document of the next editor at Look, who is William Atwood. Remember William Atwood? Yep. Part of the dual track policy where Kennedy was putting out a feeler to see if it was possible with Castro to try to have peace talks and to have some sort of rapprochement. Atwood became the editor in 1967 for Look, and he writes a glowing article about why the CIA is necessary and why they're getting bad press over having influenced the National Student Association, because that story was breaking, and this is a very strong defense of CIA actions inside the country where a former ambassador says a few kind words about the CIA, which he did in Look magazine. And I think you'll find these useful. They are online. We'll just pass this around. Y'all can see them. You know, when I ask my students, what do you remember of Martin Luther King in 1968? I said, well, he's working on civil rights and he was brave and, you know, he spoke about love. They really don't have much of the specifics of the Poor People's March, the struggle for sanitation workers to get dignity, the statements against Vietnam, or the sense of radical selflessness. And, you know, I'm happy to walk them through it. I thought, incidentally, that Randy did a terrific job overviewing King and the case. And for most of my students at the intro level, they really don't have much background. I might get one that knows what King was doing in 1967 or 68. I might get one that knows what Eisenhower was doing before he was president. I mean, the whole notion of teaching to the tests in high school just doesn't work. They memorize and they forget. Randy's comment about academia is true. Working on the question of media coverage of the assassination of John Kennedy did not get me a PhD. It was too hot to handle. And we still don't see that type of work because it's outside the paradigm. If it was a coup d'etat, then what they're teaching in political science has been wrong for decades. It's very tough for them to admit it, and philosophers talk about these questions of paradigmatic change, which oftentimes comes when the older professors pass away and the younger ones they haven't really won the battle in terms of winning the argument with the older professors, just they're the professors that are now teaching. And I think that is what occurs with it. So I was also going to share with you a bit of what King was saying in 1967 with the famous speech at Riverside Church. And I'll use some different quotes. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. There's no great sadness without great love. If America's soul becomes poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. I watched the buildup in Vietnam as if it were the idle political plaything of a society gone mad with war. You know, he. So if I was to jump to other parts of my notes in the interim, King was also saying to the churches that any religion that professes to save the souls of men and doesn't confront the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that cripple them, is a dry as dust religion. He said to support the sanitation workers in Memphis. Remember, they were holding up the signs, "I am a man," and the city wouldn't talk to them about wages or conditions. He said, it is a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. Poverty in the midst of plenty in America is as cruel as cannibalism. His language was particularly crisp. It doesn't get quoted much. He said, we seek a revolution of values to accompany the freedom and scientific revolutions.
Sorry to interrupt, but apparently the power's out in the whole building. So, now would you like to continue as is now? What we got? Can folks continue?
If I had a light, I could see my notes, but unfortunately I'm reliant on them. It's the first time I've delivered this talk.
Got a light for Mel?
Trying not to blind
Yeah,
you.
I'm wondering if we can put it some sort of an angle where I can see my notes, because I'm happy to continue, but I really need to look at it. Let's see.
I don't mind holding this for you if you're okay with that.
All right. Yeah, well, you guys are really cool to try to make it work. I'm wondering. Thanks.
Mal, you can put this on your resume that your talk was so important they had to shut it down. The only way they could.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. I'm glad
I think I can proceed with this.
Sure.
Well, if you'll bear with me, King's
Be quiet, he's talking. I'm loud.
King talked about a revolution of values, and you saw some of it with Randy's presentation. Revolution of values to accompany the freedom and scientific revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin to be a people-oriented society, not a thing-oriented society. When profits and computers and property rights are more important than people, then racism, materialism, and militarism can't be conquered. Now, my hunch is the more radical King of 67 and 68, you didn't hear much about even 55 years later in the mass media. I mean, I was going to have, raise your hand if you were hearing or say aloud, I heard something on that. April 4th or the last Martin Luther King Day. And what I want to submit is that portion of his message also has been smothered. We not only didn't hear about the nature of the research on the investigation into his assassination, even though it's been laid out a number of times in book form and in some places in the media, but there's been a retrenchment so that essentially they fall back to the House Select Committee report or the report from the Department of Justice and essentially leave it there. And we find that true with a lot of the retrospectives on the assassination of President Kennedy. Let me, that could work. That's a good idea. The New York Times headline after the assassination of Martin Luther King was standard across the country. Martin Luther King is slain in Memphis. A white is suspected. Johnson urges calm. Riots erupted in 125 cities, the worst civil disturbances since the Civil War, 6,000 arrested. The nature of James Earl Ray's flight forced the mass media to rely on FBI sources, steadily framing public opinion toward the lone assassin. The role of author Bradford Huey and his close ties to the FBI are critical to further framing the early reporting of James Earl Ray as a stalker, a loner, and a violent racist. In a memo to Hoover from the special agent in charge in Birmingham, quote, Huey advised that he'd be most willing to divulge all information he has received to the Bureau on a confidential basis, as well as all information he may receive in the future. Ray's first lawyer, Arthur Haynes, a former FBI agent and CIA informant, was instrumental in arranging the contract with Huey. According to Ray, at the first meeting with Haynes, the only thing discussed was the book contract, and Ray said that anything he told Haynes showed up in a Look magazine article before the trial. Look magazine, like Time Life, had tight intelligence connections, and you all know about Henry Luce and C.D. Jackson of Time Life working with the CIA since the early 1950s at the highest level on Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. And Look would help frame Ray just as Life helped frame Oswald. Look's first article, Huey laid out the FBI blueprint, but at least tried to keep Ray's confidence as he was talking to him and claimed that there was someone by the name of Raoul. But Ray became suspicious of Huey and fired his first lawyer, Arthur Haynes, thought the deal with Huey would end, but Houston lawyer Percy Foreman, longtime friend of Lyndon Johnson, covertly continued to work with Huey. By mid-March 1967, Huey told reporters, quote, he had doubts of any conspiracy, and NBC and ABC ran with that perspective. The second Look article, November 26, 1968, Huey omitted that Raoul called Ray to New Orleans, and that due to fatigue, Ray stopped in Selma. Huey made Ray appear to act alone as well as a violent stalker. By the third Look article in April of '69, it was titled, Why James Earl Ray Murdered Dr. King. Huey asserted that King was in Selma, where Ray had stopped for a night, although King was actually in Atlanta. Huey refined this narrative in his book of Ray as the lone racist stalker the following year. Foreman even stated that if Ray had not taken a guilty plea, it would have been his duty to take the stand against his own client. Other authors with intelligence ties, Hampton Sides, Gerald Frank, Gerald Posner, Gerald McMillan, all with ties to intelligence, would strengthen this narrative. Washington Post by March 1970, a major story entitled, Ray Alone Still Talks of a Plot, and William Bradford Huey was described as, quote, the most knowledgeable man about details of the alleged plot. Dick Cavett interviewed Percy Foreman on his show in August 1969 and asked, how did you get James Earl Ray to change his plea? And Foreman, an old friend of LBJ, replied, I didn't get him to change his plea. I simply told him that I thought he'd be executed if he didn't. Years later, Jerry Ray testified at the Memphis civil trial. By way of background on the case, quote, Percy Foreman, this is Jerry Ray and his interpretation of what his brother had to say. Percy Foreman came in, said this is going to be the easiest case I've ever had. There's no evidence against James Earl Ray. He did that up until a month before the guilty plea. Then he started crying, saying they're going to execute him. James asked for him to resign from the case, but Judge Battle said that if he fired Foreman, he had to go with a public defender. Foreman leaked the suggestion of an imminent plea bargain to the wire services and a reporter from the Huntsville Times. According to author Phil Nelson, the reporting of the Daily World reflected the widespread sentiment in the African American community. Quote, "Murder, cover-up, outrages nation." If I'm to briefly drift back to early coverage of the assassination of President Kennedy, very different strategies were employed, far more nuanced, and I'd like to share just a couple of them. An hour and 15 minutes after JFK was assassinated, well, let me backtrack for a second. The press pool that normally is part of a presidential motorcade was shifted away from being close to the president to being the seventh in line, which prevented them having the ability to take pictures. At the impromptu press conference at Parkland Hospital an hour and 15 minutes after President Kennedy was shot, acting press secretary Malcolm Kilduff described that the president died of a gunshot wound to his head, and he pointed to his right temple. Parkland surgeons who cared for the president described the neck wound as one of entrance, and the wound to the back of the president's head as one of exit. This would indicate shots from the right front, the grassy knoll. Later that evening, Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the doctors, was repeatedly pressured by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore to state that the neck wound could have been one of entrance or exit. When the Warren Report asked for a transcript of the press conference, the Secret Service said it could not locate it. We now know from the work of the Assassination Records and Review Board that this was false. The Secret Service had a record of the transcript and the videotape, and that the Secret Service had confiscated videotapes from other local TV stations. Recall that the Secret Service destroyed thousands of their files after the Assassination Records and Review Board asked for them. And just to fast forward to the President's Secret Service today, destroyed their texts regarding their communication before and on January 6th for the insurrection. Back to November 22nd, 1963. Dallas Morning News reporter Seth Cantor was directed to call Hal Hendricks, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Miami News, for background on Oswald. He found that the FBI and the Warren Commission classified his calls the day of the assassination. We now know that Hendricks was a key CIA asset, and former Washington Post reporter Jeff Morley has uncovered through his lawsuit that Hendricks was part of CIA Operation Amspell, initially framing the story from the outset. At the Dallas Times-Herald, reporter Connie Kritzberg reported on what the doctors at Parkland Hospital said at the press conference. But afterward, her editor was visited by the FBI, who added a sentence that it was possible that there was only one wound. After the day of the assassination, Dallas Morning News reporter Mary Woodward reported that some of the shots came from the grassy knoll. This was omitted from subsequent editions. That day, the Dallas Morning News quoted Mayor Earl Cabell, who claimed that the assassination was the irrational act of a single man. Mayor Earl Cabell's brother, General Charles Cabell, had been fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And finally, in 1997, the Assassination Records and Review Board released a file that showed that the mayor had been a CIA asset. Similar perspective was written about in the Boston Globe by Priscilla McMillan, who was a CIA asset, who said Oswald was the stuff of fanatics, end quote. After Ruby killed Oswald, J. Edgar Hoover and Assistant Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach issued a statement to stop speculation. Quote, "The public must be convinced that Oswald was the lone assassin and he did not have Confederates." And the mainstream media largely fell into line. Day after this, a reporter from the New York Times named Peter Noyes had a conversation with an NBC cameraman about Oswald's links to David Ferrie and Carlos Marcello. Immediately afterward, an FBI agent told him he should never discuss this for the good of the nation. Best film footage of the assassination, taken by amateur film photographer Abraham Zapruder, was put up for sale to the media, and y'all know the story of Dan Rather bidding for CBS and running and reporting on air that the president's head snapped backward, not forward. He later wrote it was a mistake. The film was purchased by Time Life, very popular at the time, yet they elected to show only 31 frames of the film and omitted the frames that would indicate shots could come from the front. They actually printed 3 different versions of the story, and in the last version, reporter Paul Mandel creatively claimed that Kennedy turned to the right, thus exposing himself to the sniper's nest. Life's assistant to the Special Projects Director, James Wagenvoord, noted that a major story linking LBJ to his corrupt aide Bobby Baker was supposed to run the next week, but it was quietly spiked. He also recalls, and this is just a few days after the assassination, that he was handed a manila envelope by someone with FBI credentials, which also had video footage of Oswald handing out pro-Castro flyers in New Orleans. Now let me step back for a little bit to clarify some of the ties between the media and the CIA, and a seminal article from Carl Bernstein on that in 1967 in Rolling Stone, the CIA and the media. 77, excuse me, thank you. Yes, quite an article, and a very different type of expose than we got from Bob Woodward, who we know was military intelligence and didn't write about these questions. And Bernstein raises a range of issues about reporters sometimes would work with the CIA wittingly, unwittingly, sometimes with the support of owners and management. They took on the job of foreign correspondents, as we saw with this editor for Look magazine, who interviewed Khrushchev and then reported back to McCone, who was then heading the CIA. Sometimes, as Bernstein writes, after a foreigner is recruited, a case officer has to stay in the background, so you use a journalist to carry messages back and forth. This was done extensively. Sometimes stories were given to reporters in other countries serving up black propaganda or gray propaganda, and he goes on. It's an article that warrants rereading. Incidentally, when Senator Church looked into the role of the CIA and the media, looked into the role of the CIA with his investigation in 1976, they did look into the role of the CIA and the media, and they concluded that there were 400 to 600 reporters that had a relationship of one form or another with intelligence agencies. And the researcher who worked on that committee, Locke Johnson, who teaches on national security issues at the University of Georgia, I talked to, and I asked him, this is what your report said, is that really the case? And I'll never forget, he said, at least that many. That report has not been declassified yet. We know from other research that James Angleton, head of counterintelligence, ran a completely independent group of journalist operatives who worked with him, and the CIA even ran a formal training program to teach agents to be journalists. Close relationship with Alan Dulles and John Hayes and Phil Graham, the Washington Post, William Paley, CBS. CBS was probably the organization that had the closest ties, although the ties with the New York Times were also quite close. Copley News was very close. General Victor Krulak, head of the Copley News Service. Former New York Times editor Harrison Salisbury said essentially they were of the media elites and top intelligence agents were of the same social circles, married into each other's families. As he writes, they were Yale and Harvard and Princeton, lawyers and bankers and businessmen and journalists. They were Alan Dulles, Ben Wells, Walter Sullivan, James Angleton, John Oakes, New York Times. They were Kim Roosevelt, who pulled off the coup in Iran, Pope Brewer, Kenneth Love, James Reston, New York Times, Wallace Carroll, Richard Helms, Frank Wisner, Tracy Barnes. These people would party together. Sometimes the Grahams would hold salons on Sundays where they would get together. CBS President Colonel William Paley and Alan Dulles were social friends, as well as had a working relationship. CBS executive Frank Stanton also had a long working relationship on psychological warfare with the CIA. The list goes on and on. So in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. Well, say a little bit more on NBC. NBC was owned by RCA in 1963. RCA chairman of the board, General David Sarnoff, worked in the Signal Corps and restored the destroyed Radio France, which was renamed Radio Free Europe, and became a part of a major project by Alan Dulles. RCA became the technological base of the National Security Agency, and Sarnoff helped staff the NSA in the 1950s. Sarnoff's son, Robert, worked in broadcasting for the OSS. David Sarnoff was also a member of the Citizens Committee on Communications for International Cooperation and the former president, as well as a permanent director of the Armed Forces Communications and Electronics Association, which, as Sarnoff said, serves the industry military team. In 1986, NBC was bought by GE, a major defense contractor. Just a year before, ABC was bought by Cap Cities, a conglomerate with strong ties to the American Intelligence Committee, and William Casey, recently resigned director of the CIA, was a founder and former director of Cap Cities. I think it's interesting to note that the major news services, Associated Press and the United Press International, were both completely cooperative with the Johnson administration with their books about the assassination, which were released prior to the Warren Commission, named A Torch Has Passed in 4 Days. and they completely support the Warren Commission findings without raising any significant questions. Perhaps some of the attitude at the time can be seen through a later interview with former ABC anchor David Brinkley, who claimed that the media deserved credit for calming the nation. The media was not allowed to view the Warren Commission proceedings and did not object. There were a number of bold reporters that got in critical stories at the time, but many times through alternative journals, whether Mark Lane with The Guardian or Fred Cook, who also shopped his material around and at first couldn't even get The Nation, Playboy, or Ramparts to cover it. Vincent Salandria, Richard Dudman, Penn Jones, Dorothy Kilgallen, who ultimately was assassinated because she was looking into the ties between Jack Ruby and the mob, according to Cyril Wecht, when I talked with Cyril. Warren Report was released, and it was greeted by the mainstream media as exhaustive, as the definitive history. The Washington Post said, quote, "It's impossible for rational men to believe that the commission could be either corrupted or deceived." Walter Lippmann, famous columnist at the time, said the report deals with all facts and it is authoritative. The New York Times stated that the report was the definitive history researched in archaeological detail. Now, on the day of the release of the 888-page report, CBS ran a 2-hour piece completely supporting the report. We can just guess on who leaked the information. NBC ran a 1-hour piece, initially framing the story and framing Oswald as the lone nut. For some of those who are newer to the research community, I want to note that the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits upon which the report was based, they weren't released for another 2 months. And it was never indexed, so you couldn't research it at first. It's citizen patriots that dug into the readings, along with just a handful of journalists that have brought this issue to the fore, kept it alive, forced the mass media to deal with it. And that's been true with the assassination of Martin Luther King. Racing through material, let me share that after the high point of media vigor, the golden era of the media with Watergate, there was a sense that things had gone too far, that the media shouldn't flex its muscles like that, and they were far more cautious in their investigation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Senator J. William Fulbright, of which we have the Fulbright Scholarship, and one of the senators that spoke out against the war in Vietnam, declared in the Columbia Journalism Review, quote, that the Inquisition psychology of journalists should end, and that voluntary restraint was needed to reaffirm the social contract. William Greider, progressive editor of the Washington Post, wrote, quote, "There is a story wish all over town, a palpable feeling that it'd be nice if somehow the genie could be put back in the bottle. It's a nostalgic longing for the easy, consensual atmosphere that once existed among the contending elements in Washington." Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, quote, "I think the press was appalled at what happened as a result of Nixon. It was not clear that the press wanted that power. Many editors cautioned, let's watch out for the reporters who try to act like Woodward and Bernstein. This short-lived adversarial phase impacted the mass media coverage of the assassination, but it faded almost as fast as it came. And many of you know the story of ABC TV in 1975, showing the Zapruder film on Goodnight America. Our own Robert Groden was instrumental in working with Dick Gregory on this, and ABC was starting to have cold feet, and they were not sure they were going to run it. And Rivera said, "I'll take all responsibility legally, and I will quit if you don't run it." And that's what caused the show to be aired. Robert, if you're with us, is that about right?
That's correct.
Anything you'd like to add?
Just the actual quote that Geraldo said at the time was, "If you don't run it, get yourself a new boy."
Thanks. Let me
If you don't run it, get yourself a new boy.
Thank you. The House Select Committee, because of public pressure, was started. The public was finally frustrated with the intelligence agencies enough that they pushed for a reinvestigation, but as many of you know, the House Select Committee was gutted from the outset, since initial Chief Counsel Richard Sprague wanted a thorough investigation, and he was smeared by congressmen on the committee as well as some reporters who had close ties to the CIA and FBI, including George Lardner, Washington Post, Jeremiah O'Leary of the Star, Washington Star, and David Burnham of the New York Times, who all joined in a campaign to discredit him. Sprague resigned. The new chief counsel, Robert Blakey, agreed to sign a secrecy oath with the CIA. Meanwhile, with a quick and sloppy segue here, the Memphis mayor ordered the destruction of 180 boxes of files from the Memphis Police Department Domestic Intelligence Division. When I interviewed Congressman Richardson Pryor, I found him to be a courtly gentleman who was lamenting at the end of a 2-hour talk that the FBI and CIA lied repeatedly to his committee, that he needed more time, that he needed more money, that the military destroyed their files, and he was encouraging with kind of a patrician sense, "Keep up the good work, young man." And I knew, oh my God, this guy's telling me it was a total and complete cover-up, and the military, the CIA, and the FBI were a part of it, which got me doing the writing. And I picked the media because nobody had written about it. And you know, it's interesting. I don't think there's a book out there on media coverage of the assassination of Martin Luther King. So I have a lot of gaps in what I'm working on, but I wanted to try to tie the two together as best I could. And I think it's probably fair to say that William Pepper is like the Jim Garrison of the case, and he was treated the same way with smears and people not quoting him properly. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. If you can follow my segue back into the Martin Luther King assassination case, Robert Blakey, chief counsel for the House Select Committee, said that, "I'm sure Ray killed Martin Luther King. I'm as sure of it as I am on my birthday." And he said that a reporter for the Toronto Star that looked into Ray's ties with Jules Kimball, he said, "Andy Selwyn, the reporter is full of bullshit." Selwyn actually looked into Ray's ties with Jules Kimball in Montreal in '67, and Selwyn, the reporter for the Toronto Star, interviewed a nurse who had dated Kimball and claimed that Kimball had called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in her presence. When Professor Philip Melanson tried to get more information from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he was met with stiff resistance. John Newman may have more to share on that tomorrow. The House Select Committee on Assassination was summed up by Congressman Walter Fauntroy regarding the King assassination. He said, quote, "We admittedly concluded our investigation without having thoroughly investigated all the evidence that was apparent. The investigation focused on Ray, and there was no vigorous Fourth Estate. There was an officious-looking report that lay unexamined by the mass media. Further investigations of the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King languished in the mass media. They were kept alive by the citizenry. I want to submit that all of our institutions had failed at that point, whether it was academe, or the church, or the mass media, or government. It was the citizenry that kept us alive, and Oliver Stone, who jolted the country with his movie JFK, that caused a great backlash, although it did get some positive press on it. It was mixed. You know, there's a book of the movie that documents every line in the movie. Stone had all sorts of people working with him to try to do a great job. Some people in here cooperated. I think it was, you know, the Hollywood version, but it laid out a narrative that the public could understand, and it resonated. And for the first time in American history, a film led to a law, because there were hundreds of thousands of letters. Open the files. And it led to the Assassination Record and Review Board, which has declassified over 4 million pages that Congress hadn't seen up until then. You know, I think it's fair to say, you know, if we were in Europe, and this was France, they'd say that old republic died. There was an assassination, and then more assassinations in the 1960s. And if it wasn't for the citizenry, we wouldn't have been able to keep these cases alive. Maybe it's a different republic that we're creating now. And I want to go through some of the coverage subsequent, because while Oliver Stone's movie was greeted with mixed reviews and a lot of vitriol, and he was accused of not being a historian, he fought back bravely, and he did 30 years later a documentary with James DiEugenio, and the documentary is quite good, but there's no media reviews on it to speak of.
In America, outside there.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to. It's for the revised version of my book. I'll try to update it. Thank you. There's so much to cover, and I'm jumping around, so please forgive me. Let's get the microphone back up there real quick. Okay. So seemingly the uproar over the movie JFK helped open the door to the 1993, is this the right level? Okay. So HBO does a mock trial of James Earl Ray, and I think it's fair to say that the movie JFK helped open the door and create a public atmosphere for it, that it might be more acceptable. And although Ray was found innocent, the show was ignored by the mainstream media, with the exception of Carl Rowan, reporter for the Baltimore Sun, whose piece was titled, "After 25 Years, the Truth Begins to Emerge." And Rowan noted that Ray had been manipulated by his lawyers. He was a fall guy, that he could not have made the changes in King's plans to stay at Lorraine, that he could not have had all the black police and firemen reassigned so they could not be witnesses to the murder. He could not have cut down the bushes to destroy the crime scene the day after the assassination. And he could not have suppressed the witnesses saying shots came from the bushes. We have 5 witnesses saying the shots came from the bushes. 1993, ABC Primetime with Sam Donaldson featured Lloyd Jowers making peace with his conscience, confessing that he'd indirectly been involved in a conspiracy with mafia leader Frank Liberto, that he'd received $100,000 for facilitating the removal and destruction of the rifle used to kill King, and that a man came to see him whose name sounded like Raoul. A huge breakthrough, but follow-up stories were few and far between. Memphis Commercial finally published a front story titled, "The Army Feared King, Secretly Watched Him." Subtitle was, "Spying on Blacks Started 75 Years Ago." History Channel ran a piece which interviewed Melanson and Pepper, and then set Pepper up to respond to an Army intelligence agent who called him a liar and denied being in Memphis the day of the assassination. The impression was that the case was far from being solved, but Pepper's credibility was somewhat tarnished. In the Memphis, William Pepper, working with the King family, moved toward the device of a civil trial to serve as what in other countries would be called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a civil court to finally investigate the case. And they concluded December 8th, 1998, all 12 jurors sided with the family of Martin Luther King in the wrongful death suit against Lloyd Jowers. I looked at media coverage of the trial. Most of you have read through Pepper's book. I know some of the students haven't gotten to it, but I thought the coverage would be interesting to note, because now we're talking 1998, where they finally, 30 years later, going to do some real reporting on it. The case had been laid out. It went to the Justice Department that did nothing with it. The New York Times carried the verdict on page 25. The Times somehow asserted that a vast conspiracy was alleged, but not proven, and omitted the reason that Ray pleaded guilty in the first place. Gerald Posner was given the final word, claiming that the trial would be a footnote in history. Posner claimed that people believe conspiracies because it matches the stature of the man and gives more meaning to his death. The LA Times buried its coverage on page 24. They overviewed the history of the case and made it seem as if Ray was guilty. Their story ended by quoting the Memphis homicide investigator who originally investigated the case, claiming that, quote, "Pepper was the biggest liar that ever hit the ground. He'll say anything for a little notoriety." A few days later, LA Times ran an editorial from Earl Afari Hutchison, who wrote, quote, "Despite the Memphis verdict, the evidence is irrefutable that Ray was the trigger man." U.S. News & World Report characterized Pepper as a man prone to bizarre theories, which sounds a lot like how the press characterized Jim Garrison in 1967. Their article, U.S. News & World Report, relied on King biographer David Garrow, who called the verdict, quote, "almost meaningless." Quote, "We don't know who aided and abetted Ray, but anyone who doesn't accept Ray as the gunman is from Roswell." Washington Post article by Tom Jackman was somewhat more extensive. Members of the King family, along with Andrew Young, John Lewis, and Reverend James Lawson, expressed support for William Pepper's case. Many aspects of the new evidence were briefly presented. Again, biographer David Garrow was quoted, quote, "The King children are part of a larger population of the American people who need to believe that the assassination of King or Kennedy must be the work of mightier forces rather than victims of small fries." The article also noted that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Counsel, Barry Kowalski, reviewed the results of the civil trial and concluded that Ray was guilty and there was no government conspiracy. Now, since none of the contradictions between the civil trial and the Department of Justice report were mentioned or pursued by the Post, I have to agree with them. Democracy dies in darkness. They had the best article, but they didn't ask nearly the questions that they could have asked with something so important 30 years later. In mid-December, Posner wrote a syndicated column, and you can guess where this is going, so in the interest of time, I won't go through it. St. Louis Dispatch used Posner to discredit the verdict and called him a King assassination scholar. Memphis Commercial Record had Mark Paruschia, who covered the civil trial, who wasn't there every day, and wrote that the courtroom's almost empty and interest is waning, while considering that most of the major news outlets didn't cover it, it's not surprising. A week into the trial, he said, the odd and unusual reigned in the trial and the conspiracy lawsuit. In comparison, even during the Clay Shaw trial, Jim DiEugenio writes, both the New Orleans State's Item and the Times-Picayune did a pretty good job with the daily summaries. A little bit further on this, Atlanta Constitution editorialist Cynthia Tucker wrote that the Jowers story is utterly unbelievable and that Pepper's conspiracy theory was, quote, a fanciful notion which the King family finds credible. Author Dick Russell, in his expose in High Times in 1999, investigated the removal of Judge Joe Brown, who was aggressively pursuing the ballistics information. I've talked to Judge Brown at conferences. He's presented. Oh my gosh. He does a great job. Listen to the title of his article for High Times. A king-sized conspiracy. The judge investigating the 30-year-old assassination of Martin Luther King turned up so much evidence of government complicity and cover-up that he's been yanked off the case, and you won't hear about that in any other publication in America. He goes on to say, Judge Joe Brown, what you got in terms of physical evidence relative ballistics is frightening. First, it's not the right type of rifle. It's never been sighted in. It's the wrong kind of scope. With the 30-06, it makes a particularly difficult shot, firing at a downward trajectory. Above all, according to Brown, the metallurgical analysis excludes the bullet taken from the body of King from coming from the cartridge case they say was fired in the rifle. The bullet was originally sent to the FBI intact. What came back was fragments, but there was a piece of that intact bullet. In the last 4 years, that photograph, which was marked into evidence, is missing. A number of items were removed from the case. There was one well, you get where this is going. Judge Joe Brown concludes his article in this article by saying, an analysis suggests that what you got in this case was a stooge whose task was to throw everybody off course. You have to be the worst culpable moron to go for that story. He said that. So you have High Times and Playboy magazine being cutting edge on political assassinations. Where's John Oliver when you need him to say something sarcastic? So I went through the 50th year commemoratives, and they don't raise the tough questions. I'd like to get to that. I kind of blew it in terms of time, but suffice to say, they didn't raise the tough questions. Neither did the 2010 piece on NPR. That didn't get into it. And I think I'd like to conclude with a few comments, and if I might run over by just a minute. We see a similar pattern of cover-up with the 9/11 attack. Initially, the media was doing a lot of reporting, but after the citizen-inspired inquiry was finished, the mass media didn't cover it very much. They can have plenty of time in retrospectives after 9/11 to raise the questions, and I would submit they don't. This April 4th, raise your hand if you saw, because there's a lot of different news sources out there, anything remotely like a mainstream source talking about the Martin Luther King assassination and raising questions. Now, this is a small sample size, but you all do follow the media. Please raise your hand if you saw any decent coverage the 55th anniversary of the assassination. Okay, if you look around, no one's raising their hand. I'd also submit you didn't hear what King was saying in 1968, and I think this might be what happens to biblical prophets 55 years later. So I want to share with you just a few comments from King that I remember reading as a student when I started in 1968. King talked about a revolution of values to accompany the freedom and scientific revolutions engulfing the earth. Let me go further. A true revolution of values will look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it'll look at working people displaced from their jobs with reduced incomes as a result of automation, with the profits of the employers remaining intact, and say this is not just. It'll look across the oceans and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of those countries, and say this is not just. It'll look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting the poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. A genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis, our loyalties must become global rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. This often misunderstood and misinterpreted concept has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I'm speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is the key that unlocks the door to the ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about the ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. King said the truth crushed to earth will rise again. Thank you so much.
You would stay up here for just a second. Ladies and gentlemen, Mal Hyman. I believe that we lost our feed to Zoom, so I want to recap what happened before I say what I want to say. We had a power outage. We lost our lights. We lost our sound. In spite of that, Mal, in the midst of his presentation, did not stop. He had the fortitude and the unflappable nature that he was going to continue, and he did. And he gave a great presentation. I want to thank Wayne for bringing up a spotlight so he was able to read what it was that he had to read to us. And I want to acknowledge our audience who through it all sat through and listened to this man's presentation. It was a moving moment to me. And I'm going to propose that we have an award called the Mal Hyman The Show Must Go On Award that we present to speakers who have the biggest challenge in presenting their award. And so, Mal, you are the first recipient of your own award.
Thank you.
And I just want to check, should we do some of our presentations by candlelight? I think that'd add a nice little ambiance.